Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll get started in just another minute. My name is Jessica. I'm with the Chelmsford Library, and this is Tracey Nguyen Mang, who is with the Vietnamese Boat People podcast, and she will be doing her presentation very shortly. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Yeah, before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for coming online tonight for this program. This program is part of a series, a really great series of One Book 2022 programs that highlight the importance of history, compassion, and storytelling around our chosen novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I would like to invite everyone in this presentation to be sure to register for the virtual visit by the author on Thursday, May 26th at 7 p.m. when he will be in conversation with Professor Sandra Lim of UMass Lowell's Department of English. I think it promises to be a very special event, and we do still have copies of the book if anybody is interested in picking one up still. We've just had a really incredible response to it so far. But tonight, we welcome online Tracey Nguyen Mang. Tracey Nguyen Mang is the creator and host of Vietnamese Boat People podcast and nonprofit. She fled Vietnam with her family at the age of, I should say, award-winning podcast. She fled Vietnam with her family at the age of 3, but it wasn't until 2018 that she began to learn about and document her family's story. Along the way, she discovered that there were many others like her trying to piece together the history. And so she began the Vietnamese Boat People project and podcast. Vietnamese Boat People is a nonprofit and award-winning podcast with the mission to preserve and carry forward the stories of the Vietnamese diaspora. The organization seeks to educate and inspire listeners on the diaspora history of the Vietnamese Americans and evoke more empathy towards the millions of refugees around the world today. In addition to the podcast, VPP's public programs empower people to preserve their own stories through storytelling workshops and events, story slams, community blogs, conversation kits, and journey mapping. Today, she will talk about all of this, the journey she took to creating this amazing project, and the myriad ways they are continuing to grow and share these stories with others. Please submit your questions and comments to the chat or the Q&A module to be asked after the program. And with that, I will turn it over to Tracey. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I am so honored to be invited to do a talk with the library. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So if you just give me 1 second. And Jessica, if at any time you can't see my screen, just let me know. As Jessica mentioned, I am the founder and the creator of our podcast and nonprofit organization. And so for today's presentation, I put together some materials that will share with you sort of the inspiration behind why I wanted to start the podcast, how it came together and became very much a project that's focused on the community. So not on any one individual, but collectively as a community, our stories. What I'd like to do is to start us off with a quick video. My name is Tracey Nguyen Mang, and I was a refugee. I was born Nguyen Quang Trường Anh in Nha Trang, Vietnam, a post-war baby. My family risked our lives to flee Vietnam by boat in search for a better life. But we were not alone. There were millions.
We say, get to the ship. Don't look back. Don't look for mom. Don't look for dad. Don't look for anybody.
From the rain and tidal waves, the boat was filling up with water, and she was afraid they wouldn't make it.
The ocean is very loud. On the seventh day, there's a big storm. Everyone's panicking.
And it was probably one of the saddest points in my life there, the family being split apart at that moment.
They kept saying, you don't know half the story. Like, you don't know the real story. And I was like, well, then tell me. And they're like, we can't. You would fall out of your chair.
And I remember walking into 4th grade in Montgomery, Alabama, the first day, and they stared at me and I stared at them. And I just realized, oh, it's gonna be bad. And it was, until I got my voice back, until I learned enough English to yell back at them.
It was all about assimilation. I remember just like having friends over in our house, and I was just making sure that our house doesn't smell a certain way, that it doesn't smell like nước mắm,
Mắm ruốc,
or mắm ruốc, or anything of that sort.
I think every Vietnamese American would agree when I say that living in the States means navigating two very different worlds.
Join me in documenting the stories of hope, survival, and resilience of the Vietnamese diaspora. Search for Vietnamese Boat People on your favorite podcast app, or visit our website at vietnameseboatpeople.org. So if anyone is not as familiar with the Vietnamese diaspora, it really began after the ending of the Vietnam War. And between 1975 to 1992, it is estimated that almost 2 million people risked their lives to flee Vietnam. And it was considered one of the largest mass exodus in modern history. What is really alarming is that to this day, we still don't have clear estimates of how many attempted the escape and how many have perished at sea. Some estimates have been anywhere from 200 to 600,000 people that may have died trying to escape. And this project is very personal to me because growing up, I did not feel that our stories were shared in history books. I felt like what I learned in school was mostly about America's involvement in the Vietnam War and what it was, but not about any humanizing stories about the Vietnamese civilians themselves or the refugees or what it was like to leave the country and assimilate into a new one. What I saw was also that the experiences were marginalized in a way that they were represented in research studies and focus groups and perhaps some history books, but they were all diluted to data points of what this part of history was about. And I really wanted to bring forward stories that talk about just humans and generations of people, you know, moving on, living in other countries, but this part of history and the trauma behind it still gets passed on to American-born Vietnamese and what that looks like. And the last part is that this year on April 30th is the 47th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. So the population, which is my parents' and grandparents' generation, who have lived through the time of war and the diaspora, and the exodus, it's an aging population. And I felt like the window of opportunity to record their stories was closing. A little bit about me is what you saw in that video earlier. I was born in Vietnam. I am the youngest of 7 children, and my family fled Vietnam in 3 different phases. If you listen to our podcast, you'll hear the experiences of why it was so difficult to leave the country. So it was considered a crime to try to flee Vietnam at the time. And there were changes in currency. So gold was used as a mean to purchase a spot on these fishing boats that would try to flee the country. And we didn't have the money, and it was too risky to put all 9 of us in one escape. So my parents actually divided us, and my dad and my brother, my oldest brother, left in 1979. Then my 3 brothers, who were between the ages of 13 and 15, going on 16, all left in 1980 together with no adults. And then my mom, when she felt that I was old enough, she took my sisters and I, My older sister was 10. My second one was 6 and I was 3. And she made the same risky escape. We were the luckier ones. We ended up all reuniting in the United States. And what I remembered was living in New Orleans in a 1-bedroom apartment that my parents rented and just trying to survive and trying to assimilate. And at that time, English as a second language was not common in the public school system. So for me, it was a little bit easier to pick up English, but for my brothers who were put into high school, it was really hard for them to adjust. They didn't know the language, they didn't know the culture, and it was a hard time for them as teenagers to assimilate. So along the way, they lost, who they were and didn't feel like, we belonged in the community. So we ended up moving to Northern Virginia because I had an uncle there. And so my uncle convinced my parents to move up there, that there was a greater Vietnamese population at the time, and he felt that there were job opportunities for us. So we moved to Northern Virginia. I grew up in an area within Northern Virginia, Fairfax County, in which a portion of that neighborhood was government subsidized housing. So my dad ended up getting a condo that he leased from the government. And at that time in Northern Virginia, I was 6 years old. So this is the part of my life that I remember the most. I don't remember escaping Vietnam at all. Anything I know about leaving Vietnam is from what my parents and family have told me. I barely remember my time in New Orleans, but in Northern Virginia, I really do remember what life was like. My parents were not around a lot. As most immigrant families, they, took odd and end jobs. They worked the night shift where they could. My mom at one point was a live-in housekeeper for a family, so I really only saw her on the weekends. My dad worked all day and he went to night school at a community college because he really wanted to get a degree in computer science to really, build a better life for us. My brothers at that time were done with high school. Some ended up going off to college. Others just still was trying to find their way in a new country. So my sisters and I basically took care of each other. Even though I was in a subsidized housing community, most of the public school district, the way it was divided, I ended up going to a school system that was predominantly white students. And for me, that was okay because in my household, I was Vietnamese. I spoke Vietnamese. We took care of each other. We ate Vietnamese food. We very much celebrated our heritage. But outside of my home, I was surrounded by American friends. And I almost shoved every part of my Vietnamese side behind that door when I left my house, because I really just wanted to fit in. It was also at that time that my sister renamed me to Tracy. So I was born Nguyen Quang Trung An. And when you say that in English, it's Trong An, which is my first name. And, now I'm so proud to see that people are reclaiming their Vietnamese names or giving their children Vietnamese names. But at that time in the 80s, I wanted to be American. So we all changed our names and we all adopted American name. And I became Tracy. And I'll tell you, I don't think I fully understood the trauma that my family had gone through, even though I'd heard bits and pieces of it growing up, until I was in my mid-20s and getting ready for graduate school, graduation day. So this is a photo of me getting my MBA. And I went to Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State. And it is tradition that people represent the country, their native country, with a flag. So I was prepared to walk down that graduation ceremony with the flag, Vietnam's current flag, which is the red with the star. And my parents, as soon as they found out, they were so upset. My dad couldn't even talk and my mom started crying. And my brother said, "You cannot walk down that ceremony with that flag." And that's when it really dawned on me, is that decades later, there's so much more healing that needs to be done. That for my parents, they did not recognize Vietnam's current flag. For them, Their home country will always be the flag with the stripes. And it really resonated with me that, wow, I thought we had moved on. We've built a new life in a different country. Their children are going to college, getting graduate degrees, and it was a happy moment. But just that one part of it really hit home for me, that this story is continuing for my parents and their generation. There is so much healing that still needs to happen. So here's what I knew growing up. I knew that South Vietnam, which is where my parents were born and raised, we had lost the war. And April 30th is considered the fall of Saigon. And my mom says in Vietnamese, "Cái ngày mà mình mất nước," which means that's the day that we lost our country. The first wave of refugees fled through US assisted evacuations, and it was approximately 125,000 people. Because Vietnam had been in a civil war for so long, and before the civil war between North and South Vietnam, we had been in other decades of war. Vietnam had been a country that was always fighting for independence. So you can imagine that after the Vietnam War ended, the infrastructure in the country was destroyed. Farmland was destroyed, buildings, roads, everything. And so the country was trying to rebuild itself. Many people began to escape by boat in 1975. And my mom had told me that, we weren't successful in our first try. My brothers tried 2 times. My dad tried once successfully, but that's only because there were other times where he showed up and there was no boat to be found because they got scammed. And that was quite common back then. People were taking advantage of other people. As I mentioned, there are only estimates of how many people died during the journey. There are no clear statistics of how many people have attempted and perished. And the ones that did make it to foreign land, they arrived at refugee camps and eventually got sponsored to different Western countries. For my parents, they talked about Reeducation camp. They talked about knowing friends and relatives that had to spend years in Reeducation camp because they fought for South Vietnam. And as part of the reprogramming of the new government system, they were all sent to these labor camps. My family before the war was considered actually quite wealthy. My grandfather had generational wealth in which he had built empires of businesses. And he had died before the Vietnam War started, but my grandmother took over his businesses and my mom as well. They owned multiple homes across Vietnam, but after the war, we lost everything, including our homes, which were taken over by the new government. New currencies were issued. So whatever money you had before the ending of the war, you were allowed to exchange a certain amount to the new currency. And they did that because they were trying to get everybody on the same economic playing field. Living conditions were horrid. This was a government, my mom would say, that had just gone through so much war that they were not prepared with the right leadership to rebuild the country at the time. And because of that, people were starving. Because of that, people were living in poor living conditions, and supplies and food were passed out in rations to help the communities, but none of it was organized well enough, and the leadership really just wasn't prepared for what the country needed. It was every man for itself. And my parents did tell me how even our own relatives turned their backs on us because they had to worry about their own children to feed. And so they weren't even sharing what they had with us. People stole from each other. Corruption was everywhere among the poor and the powerful. And so people wanted to leave the country. You'll hear in our podcast that education was not an opportunity. It was not a privilege like we have here in the United States. And my parents felt that their children would not be able to get an education past high school because it was so difficult at the time. And gold was used to purchase a spot on the fishing boat. And because the currency had changed so often, gold was the only stable currency. So I knew some of this, but honestly, I barely knew enough. Until one day I turned 40, and on the left, you'll see my kids. And I'm the youngest of 7. So by the time I got married, had kids, my dad turned 80 the year I turned 40. Also around that year, he had finally paid off the condo that we lived in. So he was leasing to own with the government. And right before retirement, he had finally owned that condo. And while it was a celebratory moment, it actually made me feel kind of sad because my parents had worked so long, to be able to have that moment. And my children were too young to understand what our family had sacrificed and gone through. And I thought, how sad would it be if they were to pass? And I did not know enough to be able to share it with my children when they were old enough to understand. And so that was when I decided to record my family's stories. And you'll see here, this is my mom in one of our sessions. I just bought a microphone and I took my laptop and I went to my family and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but I just want to talk about it. I want you to share everything that you didn't share. And I learned so much from my brothers and my dad, because the men in my family were very quiet my whole life about these experiences. My dad never talked about it. My mom just happens to be a very open person and we're very close. So I learned a lot through my mom growing up. But for the first time, my dad sat down with me for 6 hours and shared everything. My brothers shared everything with me. The vulnerabilities that they must have, had to share to their baby sister about how they felt being teenagers and how scared they were and how, everything was just, as a teenager, they had to become men and they had to really go work for a living to raise their baby sisters. And so it was such a special moment to be able to have that dialogue with my family. And I didn't know what to do with over 20 hours of recording. And I thought, you know what, I cannot be the only one that is trying to piece this part of history together, that is trying to learn more about my family's story. So I decided to start a podcast. And the reason why I decided to start a podcast, because as I was going through this journey of rediscovering my family's story, I started reading books that I could find written by Vietnamese authors about the Vietnamese diaspora. And in 2018, there were not very many, not like there are today in 2022. Some of the ones that I've read at that time were Inside Out and Back Again by Tan Ha Lai, Tabu's The Best We Could Do. Those were 2 ones that really stuck with me, but I was also going through oral history projects that were done in universities, and I felt like they were done in a way that made it feel clinical, and it really didn't humanize the stories. And so what I had envisioned was that the podcast was not going to be a history project or a lecture, and it wasn't going to be about notable Vietnamese people. It was going to be about everyday Vietnamese people, like my parents. And I wanted to be a form of storytelling because these are interesting stories, but if they weren't told in an interesting way, I felt like people wouldn't listen, and they were so important. And it had to be accessible and free, and it had to be bite-sized, because sometimes with these oral history projects, there's hours and hours of audio, and people don't really have that time, nowadays. So the podcast was born before the nonprofit. And it became a collection of personal stories of hope, survival, and resilience of the Vietnamese diaspora. And because I had already had my family's stories recorded, I thought, you know what, season 1, I will release my family's story. I took night classes to learn how to do my own editing and to create this podcast. At the time, I was a one-person show, so I did not have a team or an organization yet. But it was important for me to say, I'd love our Vietnamese community to come share your stories on the podcast. And, by sharing my own story, I was hoping to encourage that. Our podcast then turned into a nonprofit because I was getting so much feedback when it aired. And a lot of feedback I was getting was, thank you so much for starting this. Thank you for putting your family story out there. I've been trying to figure this out myself. And I turned it into a nonprofit because I said, what if I could help other people do this too? Our mission would be to preserve these stories because it really is a part of world history. But that I wanted to do it in a way where I would be working with the community to document their family stories, to help them, and to instill pride in younger generations about our history and culture, the pride that I didn't have growing up, because I felt like almost ashamed as a child that I was a refugee. And I grew up in the 80s where there was still stigma attached to what had happened in the Vietnam War and how Vietnamese Americans were viewed. And some of it still exists today. But because of that, I was quite ashamed of my background. And every time I left the house, I shut all of that behind me. Well, I didn't want the younger generations to grow up feeling that way. I didn't want my children to feel that way. I wanted them to feel proud of their family's history and story. And I wanted these stories to be told in our own voices. I didn't want our stories, I felt like historically had been represented by researchers and academias and journalists. And I just wanted our people to tell our own lived experiences and really, take part in shaping the Asian American narrative because we're so much a part of it. And of course, last but not least, I think the stories of refugees and immigrants today are absolutely still relevant. And sometimes there are stereotypes of why a person or a family chooses to leave their country. And I thought if the podcast could bring a listener into the personal and emotional stories of why these families feel the need to leave their country, to flee and start all over again, because it's not a hard decision, that perhaps it starts to change their perspectives and opinions of refugees and migrants in today's environment. So what you'll hear on the podcast, which you'll find on all major platforms, and it is free. So I hope after this talk, you'll search for Vietnamese Boat People and subscribe to our show. They are lived experiences. We curate them and tell them in a storytelling format. We draw on themes that are very much still relevant today, and that is intentional. Because even though these are historical stories, we want the listener to be able to relate to them. And they're not all sad stories. They're actually stories of tragedies, but also of triumph, of overcoming challenges, of reclaiming history, heritage, and identity, and really connecting the past to the present and encouraging intergenerational dialogue. We have tons of listeners that reach out to me saying, I got my parents to listen to your show, and together we start to talk about my own parents' journey and what that was like. And, for the first time, they really opened up. So I'm going to right now share with you a quick audio that will give you a snapshot into some of our episodes. And most of this is from the earlier seasons.
In South Vietnam, Da Nang has become a Dunkirk with one crucial difference. Unlike Dunkirk in World War II, Da Nang is stricken with rampant panic.
On March 30th, 1975, the New York Times published that radio contact with South Vietnamese port of Da Nang has been lost, indicating that the city had fallen to the communists.
All of a sudden we heard the clap of the hand like 3 times. And then they say, jump. And then I jumped, Dad jumped, and we threw the bicycle, jumped from the bicycle off the road and just ran, And I don't know, I just follow him, run into the bushes, it's like wooded area, just like jump, go. And it was so dark, I just blindly follow him.
They put me in jail like a month. You know, I was 13 years old. It's horrible because like the police would ask all kind of questions, and they're using one of the stick to hit me, you know, because they want me to tell the truth. I know that my mom is a part of it, involved in that, but
it was pretty much just me and the mate on the bridge in the morning. Nobody else was out. That's when I spotted dipping up and down a little boat. I can't tell you how far, but it was pretty far out. It looked like two guys and a big red flag waving. So I told the third mate, I says, we got a little boat out there. I think they're in distress.
We all were so different. I think our brothers were in the teens, so I can't even imagine what they went through, right? But we were each other's companion. We were each other's play dates. People probably thought it was weird, but, you know, we were each other's, I think, safe net. And I don't think we would survive without each other.
You're listening to the podcast Stories of the Vietnamese Boat People. What's really great about the podcast is that we do have stories from humanitarians that help the refugee crisis. And so one of the clips that you heard earlier was from Leo Larson, who was 26 and a crewman on a ship that rescued 2 boats across 2 different years of Vietnamese refugees. And when he saw our podcast, he had reached out to me and said, hey, you know, I'd love to share my story because it really was a very meaningful experience that I still think about to this day. We also have stories that were shared by refugee volunteers at the different refugee camps and what their experience was like and how they were very much a part of, you know, helping these families and individuals. So across what we do is multi-generational. So this is just a quick slide that kind of shows you what we consider generation 1 in our stories are the people that have lived through the war and fled to different countries. Then we have generation 1.5, which is a term used for people who fled as children. 1.5 meaning that they grew up in a very hybrid world, neither feeling that they're fully Vietnamese, but not feeling that they're American either. And of course, we have generations 2nd, 3rd, and beyond. So they are the American-born descendants. And they're still struggling with their identity, and they're still trying to heal and figure out how to navigate the intergenerational trauma of this history that's been passed on to them, even though they didn't live through it. But so these are stories that I think encourages dialogue in families as well. We are in season 5 of the show. So we've already produced, I think, episode 39, which was launched today. But each season has approximately a set of 8 to 6 episodes. So the first one, as I mentioned, was about my family, how our family of 9 escaped in 3 different trips and what that was like for not only my parents, but my teenage brothers, and then talks about my sister and I reflecting on these stories because we were children, so we don't really remember them, but we do remember the impact of what they had on our families growing up in America. Season 2 is faith and humanity. So we talked these stories, we share boat pushback incidents. Boat pushback is a term because the refugee crisis got so overwhelming that the neighboring countries, such as Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, all of those that were taking in refugees at the time, the influx was too much for them to manage, that they resorted to boat pushback. So if a boat had arrived at their land, they would pull them back into international waters and no longer take in refugees. And so we have experiences from people who ended up floating in international waters for over 20 days because no country would take them in. We also have an episode that talks about cannibalism that happened at sea because it's our episode that's called Bolinao 52. And it was an episode that we did with the filmmaker of that documentary, He was also a boat refugee, but it talks about a specific boat of 102 people who were out at sea for over a month, and in the end, only 52 survived. And some of those survivors resorted to cannibalism. And it's a very difficult decision to make, but it's a very moving story that we have the opportunity to share. Generation 1.5 was our season 3. And because I consider myself 1.5, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting for my generation to really talk about sort of this hybrid world that we grew up in, and what it was like to survive and assimilate, and what it was like to carry forward that trauma that our parents passed on to us. Season 4 was last year, and it was an extremely meaningful project. It was about people who talked about missing loved ones that they hope they can find again. We have an episode that's called The Perfect Storm, and Jiu Guang, who is our guest, he had talked about an 11-year-old boy who saved his life. And when they both made it to America, they got separated, and he really wanted to see if he could search for that little boy again, who is now a man, but he said he owes his life to him. We also talk about faith and religion in that season. We talked about people really searching for faith and belief that they could survive, and a guiding light to carry them through the rougher times. And we ended with episodes from adoptees. So Vietnamese children who were part of Operation Baby Lift, and that was an organized evacuation led by the US government, of which Vietnamese orphans were flown out of Vietnam to be adopted. And some of those babies who are now adults, they share their journeys in searching for their birth parents. We have some stories that successfully found their birth families, and others that are still searching. Season 5 right now is called Lost and Found. And it's about how do we grieve and heal and move on. Also, it's about reclaiming our identities or reclaiming broken relationships because of the culture and the trauma that families have had to deal with. But it's happening right now, and it's also a very heartwarming set of stories that we're bringing to the public. I wanted to share this photo and this little bit with you, because on this left, you'll see a photo. This is my sisters and I at the Singapore refugee camp. And this is Sister Teresa. She was a volunteer at the camp at the time. And so while my mom was working at the camp to kind of make money, because we had to stay there for a couple months, Sister Teresa took care of my sisters and I. And through Facebook, Sister Teresa found our podcast, and we reconnected and we shared photos of the past. And she said, how is your mom? I know you guys. And it's because I posted this small picture of me and her and my sisters. She found us on Facebook. And so she took a sabbatical from Singapore along with her other sister, and flew to New Jersey, and my family hosted them for a week in America. And it was just truly such a dream story, I felt like, because we had lost touch with her for many, many years. And through this podcast, we reconnected, and we're still in touch today. And hopefully one day I'll be able to go visit her in Singapore, but we hosted her here and she met my children. And it's, this project has brought so much meaning to my family. So the podcast is our main avenue for sharing the stories. But as Jessica mentioned earlier, we also have other public programs as part of our nonprofit. So we do community storytelling events. The one you see here actually happened before the pandemic. We are starting to slowly do more in-person events again, but we definitely have a lot virtually. But we also do a blog where some people don't want to share their stories orally, and they're, just natural writers. So we created a space where people can share personal journeys or poetry or short memoirs, short stories, and we publish it for them. And it's been an amazing part of our program because we actually have contributors from France and Germany and Australia. And so the blog has really attracted an international audience along with our podcast listeners. The conversation kit is available digitally at Vietnameseboatpeople.org/share. We are also doing a print version this coming at the end of the summer. We're actually working on it right now. And our plan is to distribute them in communities. It's a set of conversation cards in both English and Vietnamese. And we hope that families will use them and play the card game. And, you know, it will encourage parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles to share stories with questions under each of the 4 categories that you see here. I do also want to make a plug for an upcoming event that we are having next week. Every year we host a Mỹ Viet Story Slam, and Mỹ is American and Viet is Vietnamese. And so this is kind of a play on words, but this is a public platform that we created where we encourage the community to submit stories in a variety of creative formats, personal stories that are their own. And this year's theme is Lost and Found, which is season 5 theme of the podcast. And we have an open call. So people submit it. We select a handful of storytellers to showcase that evening. We also give out cash prizes for the selected storytellers. We have sponsors that put together goodie bags for them. And it's really about celebrating our stories, but again, encouraging the community to share the stories in an environment that feels safe and welcoming. So it's one of the events that I really love because we do get submissions from all over, from all ages, but I would say 80% of the people that submit are between the ages of 18 to 30. And so for me, it really feels like we're connecting with the younger audience that I hope to, you know, inspire. We also launched something new called Vietnamese Boat People Journeys. And, you know, we are a small team of mostly volunteers. So in addition to me, I have a team of associate producers for the podcast, and then everybody else is volunteers in our programs. So we really don't have a whole lot of resource and capacity to record many stories at one time, but there are so many stories out there, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And so we launched a prototype last year called Vietnamese Boat People Journeys Map. You can find it on our website /journeys, but it is a self-service platform in which we invite people to share their stories, tell us about their family's diaspora journey, upload photos, and then it gets put on a map. We also are starting to launch the end of this year, a series of enablement workshops to help people along the way. So we'll be working with them to figure out, you know, if they want to share their family stories, what's the right set of interview questions. We're going to help them shape those questions into stories with a beginning and an end, and help them through the editing process and really empower them to be able to share their stories a way that is meaningful to them, but also, you know, is crafted in a way that they can be proud of. I do have a short video that I would like to share. When we launched the prototype last year, we had a set of beta users test it and give us feedback so that we can continue to improve the platform. Right now, it's still in phase 1 development, but I invite you to visit and check it out. And in a little bit, I'll put some of these links in the chat room as well. But here is some testimonials from some of our beta testers.
It's been an incredibly healing journey to understand my parents and my cultural past with more clarity.
Their story is a huge part of my own identity as a second-generation Vietnamese American, and it serves heavily as a reminder of where, you know, we all came from and the challenges we went through to get to where we are now.
I think the more first-hand accounts we have, the more we're able to hold on to the actual experiences of the people who went through it.
I also think that it's important that we have this platform where we have the Vietnamese community preserving Vietnamese stories, because it gives us the opportunity to shine light on perspectives that may have not been shared yet. It also gives us as a community an opportunity to reclaim our stories.
When my parents would tell me about their trials and tribulations when I was younger, I couldn't wrap my mind around it because it was so unwieldy and far from the life that I knew as a child.
I just always assumed that people who left Vietnam ended up in Canada, the US, or Australia. The more I listened and the more I learned, I was just like, wow, no, the diaspora is all over the world. And to see it visually represented on the Journeys Map, I think is just really cool.
I also love that the VPP Journeys Map is a project of collective history and storytelling. It enables communities and individuals to tell their stories from their own perspective.
And it makes me feel that I'm not alone and that so many other people share similar experiences and upbringings.
As the map grows in presence over time, I really hope that more and more of the stories we tell can reach a greater audience, and that it pertains not only just to American history, but to our world history.
It's very humbling to trace out everyone's story, knowing that we are all looking and searching for the same thing. It really gives it a sense of humanity.
So I wanted to leave you with that last video of our VPP Journeys Map, because it's a project that we are building. We hope to build out further, but you know, for anyone out there that has a story to share, whether it's your own, your friends, your neighbors, you know, take a look at it. But you can also just explore the stories that have already been shared on that platform. And of course, you know, check out our podcast as well. So with that, Jessica, I'm going to go ahead and kick it back to you.
Thank you so much for that inspiring and really moving presentation. It's amazing. It's amazing the work that you've done. And I think it's inspiring because it is such a little known piece of American history. And also inspiring because because I think a lot of us really have a responsibility to dig into our pasts a little bit more and find out more about our families and where we came from. And one of the comments that came to us, one of the ideas that we came to in one of the book discussions about Ocean Vuong's novel is just how important it was for him to take on the responsibility perhaps to document, because his parents were his mother and his grandmother were so wrapped up in, you know, working every day and trying to survive, and could never really have taken the time to document, but it's such an important story to tell, and yours as well. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so we did have a couple of questions so far. Cindy Tran just wanted to let you know that that was so touching, especially I think this comment came through in the picture of you with the woman who was taking care of you in the camp in Thailand. Is that right? Or Singapore, I'm sorry.
Singapore, yes. Singapore,
yes. And that's just so amazing that she found you online and reached out. And then let's see. Kathy would just like to say, what wonderful work you've done. Thank you for sharing this. I admire your enthusiasm and sensitivity and sense of pride in your heritage. Angela thank you for sharing your story and this very important work with us. I feel it's truly healing for many people. And then Allison wanted to say that I have heard my mom say the day we lost our country. When you said that, I teared up. You briefly touched upon it, but could you say more about how your family dynamic between you and your parents and siblings has changed since you started the podcast?
Yes, so my parents are very proud, but you know, they're both in their 80s, and I don't know if they've actually listened to the podcast. I'm not sure if they have, and my dad is actually not the type that would want to re-listen to his own story. But it's brought us closer. My dad actually has sent me multiple books since then that he has found of people talking about, just the refugee crisis or their experience in escaping. And so I think he's not a man of many words, and he shows kind of his proudness of what I do in a very quiet way. And so one of the ways he does it is by, finding these books and mailing them to me with a short note inside that, I hope you enjoy this and that you could share it with Riley and Ryan when they're older. My mom, she, I have so much recording from her that I have not shared on the podcast, mostly because they're in Vietnamese. My mom is just more comfortable sharing her, most intimate and personal stories in her native language. And with the podcast, it can be hard to have it fully translated. But it's also a very complicated story, my mom's. And so, I hope to do something else with it one day, but it's brought us a lot closer because every time she comes to visit, I'm still recording her. Believe it or not. And every time I have a session with her, she, leaves, and in my head, I'm like, well, she mentioned this, but, I have some follow-up questions. So it's been a really great opportunity to dig into her childhood and, really kind of like piece it together a little bit more. With my brothers, they're just so proud. I mean, they're constantly sharing all of our stuff on Facebook. They're always donating to the mission, my sisters as well. And so, I think for me, the dynamic that's really changed though is for my nieces and nephews. So 2 of the team members on my team are my nieces. And when I started this, they're adults now. They're, in late 20s and early 30s, and one just had her first baby. And when I started this, they said, I want to be a part of this. Like, I love that you're doing this because I don't actually know like my dad's stories. They're my brother's kids. And so they joined forces and they brought their professional talent into the nonprofit, and they are, been a part of this with me. And so that's been really meaningful because also I'm the youngest of 7. So like my nieces are kind of like my sisters. We're not too far apart in age, but also I didn't grow up with little sisters. And then now they are the American born generation. So for them to want to be a part of this, and that really brought us closer together.
Yeah, it's connecting everyone. And that's really, it's continuing the story because it shouldn't just end with you either. It should continue to the next generation and next.
It's amazing. And I just wanted to add one thing. I wish I had a photo with me, but my one niece who just had the baby, she's half American, her mom's American, and then she married another American. So we have this beautiful baby in our family now who's only a quarter Vietnamese.
Wow.
And I just thought, oh my gosh, Ashley, this is going to be so amazing because when she's older, you have all of this to share with her about that one, 25% Vietnamese that's part of her DNA. And like now she has all this history behind it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Let's see, there was one. Oh, Cindy also asked, she would like to reach out and see how the resources she has to help your organization tell more stories. So we didn't, so we didn't get to the final slide. I think that you shared your email on the final slide and also Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And then you shared something about, you shared the website. And then there's a few ways to get involved. Join us for the 2022 3rd annual Story Slam, My Viet Story Slam. Explore stories on VPP Journeys Map, the VPP blog contribution, and share VPP with friends and family. And I'd be happy to send out all of this whole list to people tomorrow, as soon as I get in tomorrow, so that they can they can definitely reach out to you. But is that the best way to share their resources?
Yes, please. And thank you so much for passing that along. I also put in my email address in the chat. So
Okay.
Cindy, please reach out, or anybody else that is here today on the event. You can reach out to me anytime, or visit our website and poke around. There's tons of content there, also programs and events. I put my website in the chat room as well.
Excellent. Okay, this is kind of an interesting turn. So the Robert was saying, thank you for your beautiful presentation. Have you ever considered curating the stories in a way that would appeal to the first generation?
Yeah, you know, that's interesting because most of my stories are collected from the first generation.
Okay.
But our target audience is really a younger generation because I felt like there was a void there. And like I mentioned with my parents, I think one of the reasons why they don't listen to the podcast is because they lived through those experiences. So for them, they don't necessarily want to relive it by listening to other people's stories. But we do collect it, most of it from the first generation, but we do it in a style that would target younger generations because we feel like it's lost when, you know, it gets passed on. But, you know, we have tons of different types of listeners. In fact, I didn't really create this for academia, but in the last 2 years, I had a lot of professors who teach critical refugee studies or Asian American history, and they've included our podcast as part of their syllabus. So that's been really a surprising way to, you know, get our stories out there. And I didn't expect that, but we do have a variety of listeners as well.
Yeah. Also, the podcast episodes I've noticed they're shorter, like they're 25, 30 minutes. So you could really dig into a few stories in one listen. It's a really great project.
Thank you.
And then, okay, so there's two questions about, so Rosamond asked, do you have any family left in Vietnam? And have you ever been back? And then Angela also was wondering if you have seen any family in Vietnam or a desire to return to Vietnam to visit.
So yes, we still have extended family in Vietnam. So like relatives, cousins, aunts and uncles, not many, but we still do. I've gone back many times to Vietnam. My mom was first in line when normal trade relations opened up between US and Vietnam, and you could go to Vietnam on her visa. And she was like, bought a ticket, was like, I'm going back. And for me, I went back for the very first time in, I believe it was 2000. And I just fell in love with the country because I had no prior memory or preconceived notion of what the country was like. And I fell in love with it because it, you know, it's a weird feeling to see a country for the first time of which you grew up speaking the language.
Wow,
like, I don't know if everyone's had that experience before, but it's a very like surreal moment to, where you see people like you, where you understand everything they're saying, you know, you understand the food, the mannerisms, the culture, and but it's like, it's the first time you've been there and you're an adult. So for me, that was so meaningful. And so since then, I've been back several times. I've also done some business there. My last time back was before my children were born. And, you know, we hope to take them back when they're a little bit older and can appreciate it a little bit more. My dad, actually, it took him and my brothers a while before they were willing to go back.
Wow.
My dad, especially, I took him back my second time. He went with my mom and I and my sister. But he was reluctant because he had so many bad memories. And he was also very skeptical still of the government. He was afraid that he would be trapped there. He was afraid that they wouldn't let him back to the US. And all the things that he was afraid of was not true, but those were the memories that he had of what that country, the country was like when he left. So for everyone in my family, it's been a different experience going back to Vietnam.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I can imagine it can get that trauma can continue for your father, but I hope he gets back one day. That is all of the questions that we did have one question. Oh, can you remind me what the 2 books that you mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation were? I know you mentioned The Best We Could Do, which is fabulous
that book.
graphic novel. And I will I'll share links to those in our library catalog as well in the message I send out.
Great.
And then the other one was, okay.
I was just going to say, I just typed them in the chat. So
great.
The other one was Inside Out and Back Again by Tan Ha Lai. And it is a very short book written in poetry form. But it is based on her really coming to America as a 10-year-old and living in Alabama, and what that was like, straddling her home and these memories of what she had about Vietnam. I think she's like, I can't remember, but I think she's like one of like 9 children, raised by a single mom. So her father was in the war and was MIA and never found again. And so her mom basically raised these 9 kids and got them to the US. And she grew up in Alabama with a single mom. And she just wrote this beautiful debut novel called Inside Out and Back Again. And since then, she's done other great books. But this one I read when I was beginning my journey, and I just loved it so much. And she just brings you into this character of a child, but like everybody can kind of just imagine what it was like.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. Was she the one that appeared? Was she one of the people that appeared in the video clip that you showed where she was doing an author talk?
Yes.
Yeah, that was really funny where she was going into the classroom and oh no. Yeah. Oh, I can't imagine that. That's an incredible story. I'll have to read that one. I will.
Of course, Ocean's book is amazing. If anyone hasn't read it yet, that is like, and he writes so beautifully.
He does. And I thank you for reminding me, I do need to thank the Friends of the Library for this entire series of programming and for giving out all of these books to everybody. And yes, please tune into that. Please visit Vietnamese Boat People podcast, VietnamesBoatPeople.org, and check out the podcast. They're really wonderful stories. And we just have so many thank yous. Tracey, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing your story.
Yes, thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. I hope you subscribe to the newsletter. We have a newsletter that we share every time a new episode drops or we have an event coming up, and everyone is welcome. And we also love stories from people who are not Vietnamese, but that the experience they've either been involved or it's touched them in ways. And I get a lot of that too. It's just people saying, oh my gosh, my neighbor's Vietnamese and I grew up like around her family. And so those are, just feedback that we love hearing. So I welcome all of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tracey, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.